Britain may be watching the beginning of another political honeymoon. The cameras are rolling, the speeches are being made, the leader is travelling around the country, meeting ordinary people, talking about the cost of living and presenting himself as a different kind of politician. But beneath all of that, there is a much more uncomfortable question. Where is the actual plan? Because critics are now asking whether Andy Burnham is offering Britain genuine economic leadership or simply another round of political theatre. The accusation is brutal, lots of visibility, lots of personality, lots of carefully timed announcements, but not enough substance. And if that criticism is right, Britain could soon discover that popularity is not the same thing as progress. Subscribe now, because I'm about to break down exactly what happened and why it could change everything. Now let's look at why this criticism is gaining attention. At first glance, Burnham's approach seems straightforward. He wants to be seen as accessible. He wants to connect with voters. He wants to show that he understands the pressures facing ordinary households. And there is nothing inherently wrong with any of that. In fact, political leaders need public support if they want to make difficult decisions. But there is a problem. At some point, the photographs have to stop, the visits have to stop, the sound bites have to stop, and governing has to begin. That is the heart of the criticism. The argument presented in the source is that Burnham has been strong on presentation but weak on a clearly defined economic strategy. And that distinction could become extremely important, because Britain does not simply need another politician who can make people feel optimistic for a few months. It needs answers. How does Britain generate stronger economic growth? How does productivity improve? How do wages rise? How does the country attract investment? How does government deal with enormous spending pressures without simply putting more pressure on taxpayers? Those questions cannot be answered with a clever video. They cannot be solved with a quick announcement. And they certainly cannot be fixed by simply appearing more relatable. This is where the phrase performative politics enters the debate. The criticism is that politicians can become very good at creating moments. A visit here, an announcement there, a policy tweak, a carefully staged interaction with voters, a social media clip designed to travel across the internet. Each individual action might sound positive, but taken together, do they actually change anything? That is the test, and it is a test Burnham will eventually have to face, because the economic challenges facing Britain are much larger than any single headline. The source raises concerns about the country's debt burden and the cost of servicing that debt, warning that the government's room for maneuver is limited. That creates an uncomfortable reality. A government can promise more, it can announce more, it can spend more, but eventually somebody has to pay for it, and investors are watching, businesses are watching, markets are watching. Most importantly, ordinary families are watching. Because when government finances become stretched, the consequences eventually reach people's homes. Higher taxes, higher borrowing costs, pressure on public services, slower economic growth, less money available for future priorities. And this is why the criticism of Burnham is not simply about whether he is a good communicator. It is about whether communication is being used as a substitute for difficult decisions. That is a much more serious question. Now, Burnham's popularity matters. The source acknowledges that his public image had been performing strongly, with his more personal and accessible style appearing to resonate with voters. And that gives him something extremely valuable: political capital. If people like a leader, they may be more willing to accept difficult reforms from that leader. But political capital has a shelf life. It does not last forever. A honeymoon eventually ends. And when the honeymoon ends, voters start asking a much simpler question: what have you actually changed? That is where things could become difficult. Because genuine economic reform is rarely exciting. It is usually complicated. It can take years. It can create losers as well as winners. It can require unpopular decisions. And sometimes the benefits are invisible for months or even years. That is completely different from a political gimmick. A gimmick produces an immediate reaction. People notice it, they share it, they talk about it. But serious reform often produces very little excitement. It is spreadsheets, it is legislation, it is infrastructure, it is investment, it is regulatory reform, it is productivity, it is energy policy, it is tax policy, and it is the long, boring work of changing how an economy actually functions. That is why the criticism in this debate is so pointed. The argument is not that Burnham should stop talking to voters. It is that talking to voters cannot become the strategy. The source specifically questions whether traveling around the country to listen to people about the cost of living can produce meaningful change without creating problems elsewhere, particularly when difficult budget decisions are approaching. That is the contradiction. Everyone wants lower living costs. Everyone wants higher wages. Everyone wants better public services. Everyone wants stronger growth. But governments have limited resources. You cannot simply promise everything at once. At some point, priorities have to be chosen. And that is when politics becomes difficult. Because the easy part is telling people what they want to hear. The difficult part is explaining what has to happen to make it possible. This is also why the comparison with previous political leaders becomes relevant. The source argues that Britain has historically tended to make gradual changes rather than dramatic economic transformations. There is something powerful about that observation. British politics often moves through small adjustments. A little more spending, a little more regulation, a little change to taxation, another programme, another review, another task force, another announcement, then another announcement explaining the previous announcement. And before long, years have passed. But the underlying problem remains. Productivity remains weak. Growth remains disappointing. Public finances remain under pressure. And people's living standards struggle. And Britain is approaching a point where difficult decisions may become unavoidable. The temptation will always be to do something popular. Cut a bill slightly, offer temporary relief, announce a new scheme, give people a headline. But what happens after the headline disappears? What happens when the temporary measure ends? What happens when the bill arrives? That is where political gimmicks are exposed. And this is why the next few months could tell us much more than the opening period of popularity. If Burnham genuinely wants to transform Britain's economy, the public will eventually need to see more than personality. They will need to see results. They will need to see investment. They will need to see productivity improving. They will need to see businesses becoming more competitive. They will need to see living standards rising. And they will need to understand how the government intends to pay for everything. There is another part of the criticism that deserves attention. The source argues that bigger government has increasingly become the default answer to Britain's problems. That raises a fundamental political question. If government is already enormous, why assume that making it even bigger will automatically solve the problem? More government does not automatically mean better government. More spending does not automatically mean better outcomes. And more regulation does not automatically create more prosperity. At some point, the question has to become, what is government actually good at? What should the state provide? What should businesses provide? Where should taxpayers carry the burden? Where should individuals have more freedom? And where does government intervention genuinely create better results? These are not easy questions, but they are the questions that separate governing from campaigning. And that is perhaps the biggest danger for any popular political leader. Campaigning rewards emotion. Government rewards execution. Campaigning rewards memorable moments. Government rewards boring competence. Campaigning allows you to promise. Government forces you to deliver. The difference becomes obvious when the economy is under pressure. And history shows that Britain has faced moments when politicians were told that meaningful change was simply too difficult. The source recalls the economic crisis of the 1970s, when Britain faced extraordinary inflation, high interest rates, strikes, and power cuts. At the time, there were people who believed the country could not fundamentally change direction. Yet Britain eventually experienced a long period of economic expansion and rising prosperity from the 1980s into the years before the financial crisis. The lesson is not that one particular political ideology has all the answers. The lesson is simpler. Countries can change direction. Governments are not powerless. Economic decline is not necessarily permanent, but change requires decisions. It requires leadership. And it requires a willingness to challenge assumptions. That is why the criticism aimed at Burnham is so important. If he genuinely wants to become a transformative leader, he cannot simply rely on being popular. He cannot rely on being accessible. He cannot rely on quick political wins. And he cannot rely on voters liking him. Eventually, he has to show them where he wants Britain to go. Because popularity without delivery eventually becomes disappointment. And disappointment can arrive remarkably quickly. The source itself makes this warning. If the government fails to change direction, the current popularity could disappear surprisingly fast. That may be the real countdown now, not the next speech, not the next photo opportunity, not the next viral clip. The countdown to the moment when voters start judging results. Because once that happens, the political question changes completely. It is no longer, Do you like Andy Burnham? It becomes, is Britain actually better off? That is a much harder question, and it cannot be answered with a gimmick. It cannot be answered with a slogan. It cannot be answered by simply looking busy. It requires evidence. So perhaps the biggest challenge facing Burnham is not winning popularity. He has already shown that he can attract attention. The real challenge is proving that there is substance underneath it. Can he deliver stronger growth? Can he improve productivity? Can he create an environment where businesses want to invest? Can he control public spending? Can he keep taxes sustainable? Can he raise living standards? And can he do all of that without simply expanding the size and reach of government? Those are the questions that will eventually define his leadership. Because Britain has seen enough political theatre. Voters have seen enough announcements. They have seen enough promises. They have seen enough short-term fixes. What many people want now is something much harder. A plan, a direction, and results. So when critics describe the current approach as performative nonsense and gimmicks, the real test is not whether the phrase sounds harsh. The real test is whether Burnham can prove them wrong. If he can produce a serious economic strategy, implement difficult reforms, and deliver measurable improvements, the criticism will eventually fade. But if the next few months bring more publicity, more crowd-pleasing announcements, and more small measures without a convincing economic transformation, then the criticism will become much harder to dismiss. The honeymoon will end, the cameras will move on, and the voters will be left with the results. That is when the real judgment begins. Because Britain does not need another leader who simply looks like they are doing something. It needs a leader who can actually do it. And Andy Burnham now has the opportunity to prove which one he is. The question is, will he rise to the challenge, or will the gimmicks continue? Let me know what you think in the comments. Is Burnham building a genuine strategy for Britain, or are we watching another political performance designed to keep the headlines coming? Because in the end, the country will not be judged by the speeches. It will be judged by the results.